The seed came in a paper sack the size of a lunch pail, and it cost $4.10, which was the exact amount Eli Fisher counted out in coins and small bills onto the counter of the Belhaven Farm and Feed, for 4 pounds of purple-top turnip seed, enough to sow the 10 acres above the spring house that every man in the county had already agreed were finished ground. The ground had not grown a hay crop worth cutting since 1998, which was the year the topsoil test came back thin enough that Eli's father, Henry Fisher, had stopped renewing the lime order for it and started calling it, without much ceremony, the slope. 6 years of foxtail, 6 years of thistle working up through cracked clay, 6 years of a fence line nobody bothered walking because there was nothing on the other side of it worth checking on. That was the ground Eli Fisher meant to put turnips on, in the last week of July, with a wagon load of lime going out first and a horse-drawn grain drill going out second, and every part of the plan visible to anyone standing at the counter of the feed store when he counted out his $4.10. Roy Callahan was standing at that counter. Roy ran 400 acres of corn silage and alfalfa 2 miles east on Route 9, the biggest dairy operation left in Belhaven County, and he had opinions about most things involving hay, feed, and men who farmed with horses instead of engines. Opinions he considered useful and shared freely with whoever was in reach. He watched Eli slide the coins across the counter and said, not unkindly, in the tone of a man passing along established fact, that turnips were for the supper table, and that cows would not eat what a man could not even sell at the co-op for more than the price of the seed. He said it, and 2 other men at the counter laughed. Not unkind exactly, the laugh of men who had already decided how a story was going to end and were simply waiting for the world to catch up to their opinion of it. Eli did not answer him. He picked up the sack, settled it against his hip, thanked Dot Sanders behind the register for the receipt, and walked out to where Prince and Duke stood hitched to the flatbed in the gravel lot. That was the whole of it, as far as anyone at the counter was concerned. But there was a thing Eli Fisher had noticed on that ground that nobody else standing at that counter had bothered to notice, because nobody else had knelt down on it. He had gone up to the slope in June with a post-hole digger, meaning to check a fence corner, and driven the digger down 8 inches and hit a pan of compacted clay so hard it rang like it had something in it, and below that pan, when he finally broke through, the subsoil was dark and moist and smelled the way turned ground smells after rain, which was not the smell of dead ground at all. 6 years of nothing growing tall enough to shade it had let a crust form over dirt that was, underneath, still very much alive. That was the anomaly, the one detail he had checked with his own hands instead of assuming it from the road, and it was the reason $4.10 of turnip seed felt to him less like a gamble and more like a question he already half knew the answer to. He did not explain this to Roy Callahan at the counter. He did not explain it to anyone. He loaded the seed, thanked the horses with a hand on each neck the way he always did before a drive, and went home to the Springhouse field, and by the time the gossip about it reached the far end of the county, the turnips were already 3 days in the ground. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's begin. Belhaven County sat in the flat middle of a state that most people only drove through, a place of grain elevators and county fairgrounds and small old-order settlements tucked between larger English farms, and the Fisher place had been on the same 140 acres since Eli's grandfather bought it in 1951, back when the slope was still good ground and the spring house still ran cold, enough in August to keep milk from turning before the hauler came. Eli was 39 years old that July, a broad, quiet man who kept his hat brim low and his sentences short, and he had been running the farm alone, with help from his wife Miriam and his 11-year-old son Aaron, for 3 years, since the winter his father's heart gave out in the milking parlor on a Tuesday morning in January, quietly, without complaint, the way Henry Fisher had done most things. Eli did not talk about that winter. It came up, when it came up at all, as a single clause, the winter his father died, And then the subject moved on, because that was how the Fisher family handled the things that hurt too much to examine directly, which was not by ignoring them, but by setting them respectfully aside and getting back to the work. Because the cows still needed milking on the morning after a funeral, same as any other morning. What Eli inherited, besides the land and the herd and the debt on neither, was a green canvas-covered ledger book his father had kept for 31 years. One entry most weeks, sometimes daily during planting and calving, a record of weather and prices and small decisions, written in a hand that got smaller and more careful as Henry Fisher got older, as though he were trying to fit more of what he knew into less space before he ran out of pages, or ran out of time, whichever came first. Eli had read parts of it before, the way a man reads his father's handwriting without meaning to study it, but he had never read it straight through, front to back, until the March after the funeral, sitting at the kitchen table after Miriam and Aaron had gone up to bed, working through it by lamplight one winter at a time. The slope came up more than once. Henry Fisher had hated hard through the 60s and 70s, cutting it 3 times some seasons when the market was good, never resting it, never testing it, because in those years nobody tested ground. They just worked it until it told them to stop, and by 1998, it had told him to stop. There was an entry from that autumn, dated the 9th of October, that Eli read more than once before he understood it was not a complaint, but an observation, the kind Henry Fisher favored over complaints generally. The entry said, "The slope is done for hay, and I am done pretending otherwise." And then, underneath it, in a slightly different pen, added later, "Tired don't mean finished, it only means it's due a different question." Eli read that line the first time and set the book down, and did not pick it up again for 2 days. He read it a second time in the barn, standing under a lantern, checking it against his memory to be sure he had not misremembered it into something more useful than it actually was. He had not. It was there, plain, in his father's hand. Tired don't mean finished. It only means it's due a different question, and beneath it, smaller still, a note about a neighbor 2 townships over, a man named Amos Detweiler, who back in the drought years of the 50s had grazed cattle on stock turnips through a hard winter when the hay simply ran out for everyone else, and Henry Fisher had written the acreage down, and the seeding rate, and a rough date, the way he wrote down anything he thought he might one day need again. He had never gotten around to trying it himself. The slope sat idle instead, year after year, foxtail climbing over the fence Henry never got around to pulling, and the note about turnips sat in the ledger the same way, waiting, the way written things wait, for a reader who was not there yet. Eli did not act on the note that winter, or the winter after. He was not a man who moved quickly on anything, and a note in a dead man's ledger was not, by itself, a plan. What he did instead, over the next 2 years, was the kind of quiet research that never showed up on anyone's radar, because it did not involve buying anything or announcing anything. He wrote a letter to the county extension office asking what he ought to know about stockpiled brassica forage for cattle, and a young agent named Frank Delaney wrote back 4 pages of dense typed advice about seeding dates and frost tolerance and crude protein percentages that ran, in a well-managed stand, as high as 20%, which was better than most second-cutting hay Eli had ever put up. He asked an English neighbor, a widow named Alma Voss, who kept a small flock of sheep on the section south of him, and did occasional day work for cash, whether she had ever grazed turnips, and she had not. But she knew a retired dairyman 2 counties over who had, back before it fell out of fashion, in favor of buying feed by the truckload, and she drove Eli out to see him on a Saturday, because Eli had no truck, and the man had no interest in receiving visitors by horse and buggy on short notice. The retired dairyman, a heavy-set man named Gene Whitfield, who later turned out to be one of the regulars at the feed store counter, told Eli plainly that turnips were more trouble than people remembered, that you had to fence them off in strips so the cattle did not gorge and bloat themselves silly on the tops, that you had to introduce the herd to them slowly, a few hours a day at first, and that if you did all of that correctly, the cattle would come to the fence looking for the greens the way they came to the barn looking for grain. He also told him, without being asked, that most men who tried it once quit after the first hard year, because it looked, from the road, like nothing at all. A field of weedy-looking greens instead of neat round bales stacked in a row, and a man's neighbors judged his farming by what they could see from the road. Eli thanked him and wrote the seeding rate down in a new ledger of his own, the kind of plain composition book sold at the feed store for 89 cents, and underneath the seeding rate he copied, in his own hand, his father's line, "Tired don't mean finished, it only means it's due a different question," so that the two books, his father's and his own, would eventually sit on the same shelf saying something close to the same thing 40 years apart. The preparation, when it finally came, took most of the following spring and the first 3 weeks of summer, and none of it was visible to anyone who was not standing on the slope itself. Eli sent a soil sample to the extension office through Alma Voss, who mailed it from town since the Fishers had no mailbox at the road for anything requiring stamps beyond what the buggy trip allowed, and the results came back showing the pH low, as expected, and the phosphorus thin, but the organic matter higher than anyone had guessed, 3.1%, a number Eli wrote down and underlined twice, because it confirmed what his hands had told him with the post-hole digger the summer before. He ordered 2 tons of agricultural lime, hauled it up the slope himself over 4 trips with the flatbed and the team, and spread it by hand from the back of the wagon in June. A slow, dusty, unglamorous job that took the better part of a week and produced nothing to look at afterward except pale dust, settling back into the same tired-looking dirt. He mended the fence line nobody had walked in 6 years, resetting 11 posts and replacing 200 feet of woven wire, and he built 4 gates into the field instead of 1. Because Gene Whitfield's advice about strip grazing meant the herd would need to be moved forward a section at a time. A new gate opened every few days through the winter, rather than turned loose on the whole field at once, which would have let them waste half of it trampling what they had not yet eaten. He borrowed the community's grain drill, recalibrated for the fine turnip seed instead of oats, and made 2 practice passes on a headland before he trusted the setting, because planting too heavy would crowd the roots small, and planting too thin would waste the ground he had just spent a month improving. Only then, in the final week of July, with the lime settled and the fence mended and the drill calibrated, did he load the $4 sack of seed onto the wagon and drive it up to the slope. And only then did the plan become visible to anyone standing at the counter of the feed store. Because by then it was simply a man buying seed, the last and smallest step of a preparation that had taken more than a year and shown almost nothing for it until that morning. The drilling itself took an afternoon, Eli walking the team back and forth across the 10 acres in long even passes while Aaron rode the drill seat and watched the seed metering wheel the way his father had shown him, calling out if it ever looked to be running empty. They finished the last pass a little after 5 o'clock, the 7th of a run that had started the 22nd of July, and Eli wrote that date down that evening in his composition book. Drilled 4 pounds of purple top per acre on the slope, 10 acres total. Seed and lime combined cost $11.40, and underneath it, because he had learned from his father that a record was only useful if you wrote down what you expected, as well as what happened. If this fails, the ground still owes nobody an apology, since the lime and the fence needed doing regardless. Word of the planting reached the feed store counter within the week, the way word of anything reached the feed store counter within the week, and by the 2nd week of August it had acquired the shape gossip acquires in a small county, which is to say it had gotten simpler and funnier with each telling. Gene Whitfield told it to Roy Callahan as fact, that Eli Fisher had planted a garden on his worst 10 acres and meant to winter his whole herd on it, and Roy Callahan told it to Dot Sanders behind the register with a shake of his head, saying the man's going to starve those cows out trying to save a few dollars on hay, and Dot Sanders, who liked Eli well enough and disliked seeing anyone talked about behind their back even when she was doing exactly that, passed it along anyway to the next customer. because that was simply how information moved through Belhaven County, gaining a little weight and losing a little accuracy at every stop, the way a snowball picks up whatever is lying in the yard as it rolls. By September, the 10 acres had a nickname. Somebody, nobody later could say for certain who, started calling it Fisher's Salad, and the name stuck fast the way nicknames do in small places. Repeated at the counter, repeated at church suppers among the English families who did business with the Amish community. Repeated with the particular fondness people reserve for a joke they intend to enjoy again in a few months when it turns out to be true. Eli heard the nickname secondhand from Alma Voss, who told him about it apologetically, the way a person delivers bad news they feel obligated to pass along. He did not seem bothered by it. He said only that a name did not change what was in the ground, and went back to checking the stand, which by the 3rd week of August was showing a real problem of its own, one that had nothing to do with nicknames and everything to do with flea beetles, which had come into the young seedlings hard enough to skeletonize the first true leaves across nearly a third of the field, a genuine setback that Eli recorded plainly on the 24th of August. Flea beetle damage across roughly 3 acres of the 10. Stand thin. We'll need to judge in 2 weeks whether replanting is worthwhile, and it was not a hopeful entry. It was simply an accurate one, the kind of number a man writes down, because pretending the damage away does nothing for the turnips, and nothing for the record either. The 2 weeks Eli gave the damaged section turned out, by the 2nd week of September, to be enough for the surviving plants to outgrow the beetle pressure the way turnips sometimes will once the true leaves toughen, and rather than replant he simply thinned his expectations for that third of the field and left it be. A decision he wrote down on the 9th of September. Damaged section recovering. Stand thin but even. Expect smaller bulbs there. Leaving as is rather than risk a late second planting running into frost. It was the kind of unglamorous mid-course correction that never made it into the gossip at the feed store, because there was no drama in it, only a man adjusting a number in a composition book and moving on to the next chore, which for Eli that September was building the first strip fence across the field's western end. A temporary panel line he could open one section at a time once grazing began. Through late September and into October the tops came on thick and dark green, taller than Aaron's waist in places, and underneath them, when Eli finally knelt down in the 3rd week of October and worked his hand into the soil to check, the roots had swollen past what he had expected this early. A good, solid, purple-shouldered bulb, the size of a large fist. He pulled one, brushed it clean against his trouser leg, and weighed it on the kitchen scale that evening, and the number that came back, 2 pounds 3 ounces, was large enough that he weighed a second one the next morning to be sure the first had not been a lucky pull, and the second came in at 2 pounds 1 ounce. Close enough to trust. He wrote both numbers down on the 22nd of October, 2 samples pulled, 2 pounds 3 ounces and 2 pounds 1 ounce, undamaged section, better than expected. And then, because he was not a man given to excitement, he let show. He simply closed the composition book, set it back on the shelf beside his father's green ledger, and went out to check the fence before dark. It was not nothing, that quiet closing of the book. It was, in its way, the only celebration Eli Fisher allowed himself that whole autumn, and it was enough. Frank Delaney, the county extension agent who had answered Eli's letter 2 years before with 4 typed pages of advice, drove out to the Fisher place on the 11th of November in a Greene County pickup with a soil probe and a forage sample kit rattling in the bed, because word of Fisher's Salad had reached his office too, filtered through the same feed store counter that filtered everything else in Belhaven County, and Frank Delaney had learned in 9 years on the job that a nickname attached to a farming decision was usually worth a personal look, since it was either a genuine failure worth documenting as a caution to others, or a genuine success worth documenting as an example, and either way his office existed to know which. He walked the slope with Eli for the better part of an hour, pulling a dozen bulbs at random across both the strong section and the beetle-damaged section, weighing them on a portable scale he kept in the truck, and clipping tops for a forage sample he would send to the lab in the state capitol for a proper protein and energy analysis. He asked Eli, at one point, kneeling beside a bulb he had just weighed, whether he had tested the soil before planting, and Eli said he had, and told him the organic matter had come back at 3.1%. And Frank Delaney sat back on his heels for a moment and said that was a full point higher than he would have guessed looking at the stand from the road, and asked to see the paperwork. Eli walked him back down to the house and showed him the extension office's own lab results from the spring, the same office Frank Delaney worked for, and the composition book with its dated entries, drilled 4 pounds per acre. Seed and lime combined cost $11.40. Flea beetle damage across 3 acres. 2 samples pulled 2 pounds 3 ounces and 2 pounds 1 ounce. And Frank Delaney read through the entries slowly, the way a man reads something he is checking against his own numbers rather than simply skimming for the gist of it, and said that it was the most complete field record he had seen from anyone in the county that year, amateur or professional, and that the lab results, once they came back, would likely confirm what the scale in his truck was already suggesting, which was a stand running comparable to good second-cutting alfalfa in protein and considerably higher in total digestible energy per acre than the county's typical hay ground was producing that year, given the dry summer. He also told Eli, a little apologetically, that a woman 2 farms over had called his office to complain that the turnip field was an eyesore visible from the county road and ought to be regulated somehow, and Frank Delaney said he had explained to her that there was no regulation against growing a legal forage crop on one's own ground, however it happened to look, and that he did not intend to schedule any further visit on the matter beyond confirming, which he now had, that the field was doing exactly what it appeared to be doing. He shook Eli's hand before he left, an English habit Eli returned without comment, and said he would send the lab numbers when they came in, and that he might, if Eli did not object, mention the field in the office's winter newsletter, since other farmers in the county could likely use the example, given how the summer's dry weather had left hay supplies shorter than usual, heading into what the almanac and the radio both suggested might be a hard winter. That hard winter arrived on schedule, and it arrived on top of a summer that had already been drier than any in Belhaven County since 1988, which meant that by the last week of December, hay that would ordinarily have carried a herd through March was running out on farms across the county, closer to the middle of January, a fact that first showed up not in any official report, but in the ordinary traffic of the feed store counter, where men who had never in their lives bought hay were suddenly asking Dot Sanders whether she knew anyone with surplus bales to sell, and being told, more often than not, that she did not. Because everyone was short. Roy Callahan, with 400 acres and the biggest herd in the county, had put up what he judged a normal year's supply back in June and July, and a normal year's supply, against a summer that yielded barely 2 cuttings instead of 3, left him calculating by the second week of January that his hay would not stretch to April. And buying hay in January, when every other operation in 3 counties was short for the same reason, meant paying nearly double what it had cost in September, if a man could find it at all. Eli Fisher, meanwhile, opened the first gate into his turnip field on the 4th of December, letting the herd onto the strip nearest the barn for 3 hours the first day, the way Gene Whitfield had told him to, watching for bloat and seeing none. And by the second week of December, the cattle were coming to that gate each morning, the way they had once come to the hay wagon, pushing and shouldering for position, with one old Guernsey cow in particular, a big-boned, sway-backed matriarch Eli's father had named June, the summer she was born, because she had come into the world on the 2nd of that month, always first through the gate, and first to put her nose down into the greens, so reliably first that Eli had taken to watching her, rather than the fence to judge how eager the herd was on a given morning. He recorded it plainly on the 14th of December, herd on strip 2, June through the gate before I had it half open, good appetite across the group, no signs of bloat, and again on the 2nd of January, open strip 4 today, coldest morning yet, 11 degrees at 5 o'clock, cattle grazing turnip tops through snow cover without hesitation, and on the 14th of January, the date Frank Delaney's newsletter would later single out as the one worth remembering, hay reserves reported empty, or nearly so on at least 6 farms within 5 miles according to Talk at the Feed Store. Herd here on Strip 5, gaining condition, not losing it. No hay fed since December 4th. That contrast, hay running out on farms with 3, 4, 5 times the acreage of Eli's 10, while a field the whole county had nicknamed as a joke, kept his herd not merely surviving, but visibly gaining weight through the coldest stretch of the winter, was the kind of thing that did not need explaining once it became visible from the county road, and by the 3rd week of January, it was visible from the county road. Rows of dark green turnip tops poking up through a crust of snow with black and white cattle grazing contentedly among them, while, 2 miles east, Roy Callahan's herd stood at the fence line of an empty hay yard, waiting for a delivery truck that was 3 days behind schedule, because every other hay dealer in the region was drawing from the same short supply. Roy Callahan drove out to the Fisher place himself on the 22nd of January in his own truck, alone, which was itself a small piece of information in a county where a man's willingness to make an admission privately, without an audience, said something about how much the admission actually cost him. He found Eli at the fence, checking the wire on Strip 6 before opening it the next morning, and he stood there for a minute without saying anything, watching June work her way down a row of exposed bulbs with the unhurried confidence of a cow who had learned exactly where her next meal was coming from. And then he said, "I was wrong. 4 words, no more." Delivered flatly, the way a man pays a debt he does not enjoy owing, but has decided to settle anyway, rather than carry it further. Eli did not smile, and he did not say anything that might have made Roy Callahan regret coming. He said only, "You were working from what you could see," and that was true enough, since Roy Callahan, like everyone else at the feed store counter the previous July, had judged the slope by the same information available to anyone driving past on the county road, which was 6 years of foxtail and a reputation for being finished, and there had been no way to see the compacted clay Eli had broken through with a post-hole digger, or the 3.1% organic matter sitting quietly underneath it, or the line in a dead man's ledger that said tired don't mean finished. It only means it's due a different question. From the seat of a truck going 45 miles an hour. Roy Callahan stood at the fence another minute, watching the herd, and then he asked, in a different tone than he had used at the feed store the previous July, how many pounds of hay Eli figured he had saved himself feeding turnips instead through December and January. And Eli told him he had not fed a single bale since the 4th of December, which by his own rough figuring, based on what the herd would ordinarily have eaten in that stretch, came to somewhere near 4 tons of hay he had not needed to buy, cut, or haul, at a time when hay 2 miles east of his own fence line was running nearly double its September price and getting harder to find at any price at all. Roy Callahan asked, after another silence, whether Eli would mind him trying 3 acres of his own next summer, on a stretch of ground behind his machine shed that had never grown much of anything either. And Eli said he would not mind, and offered to walk him through the seeding rate and the strip fencing arrangement whenever Roy wanted. The same offer he would have made to anyone who asked, because there had never been any secret in it to protect, only patience most men had not yet had reason to spend. Word of the visit reached the feed store counter within 2 days, the way word of everything reached the feed store counter within 2 days, but the language had changed by the time it got there. Gene Whitfield told it to Dot Sanders, not as the story of Fisher's salad anymore, but as the story of the turnip patch that saved Eli Fisher 4 tons of hay in the worst winter in 15 years. And Dot Sanders, repeating it to the next customer, called it smart ground, a phrase that would not have occurred to anyone at that counter the previous July, and that was, in its quiet way, the real scoreboard of the whole affair. Not the tonnage, and not even Roy Callahan's 4 words at the fence, but the fact that a room full of people who had once laughed at a nickname were now calling the same 10 acres by a different name entirely, without anyone having asked them to. Frank Delaney's winter newsletter went out to every farm on the Extension Office's mailing list in the first week of February. 4 paragraphs under the plain heading of stockpiled forage results. Belhaven County, laying out Eli's seeding rate, his lime application, his strip grazing schedule, and the lab numbers that had come back on his forage sample. 22% crude protein on the November clipping, a figure Frank Delaney noted was better than the county's average second-cutting alfalfa that same year, and he included, with Eli's permission, 3 lines drawn directly from the composition book. The 22nd of July entry about seed and lime costing $11.40 combined. The 9th of September entry about the beetle damage section, recovering thin but even. And the 14th of January entry about hay reserves running empty on other farms, while the herd on Strip 5 was gaining condition rather than losing it. Because Frank Delaney had learned that other farmers trusted a dated number in a stranger's own hand more readily than they trusted a summary written by an extension agent, however accurate the summary happened to be. The newsletter reached, among other addresses, the office of a regional stocker cattle buyer named Owen Pratt, who managed backgrounding contracts for a feed yard operation 2 states over and had spent enough winters watching hay markets spike to take real interest in any documented, low-cost method of carrying cattle through a hard season. And Owen Pratt telephoned the extension office, since the Fishers had no telephone of their own beyond the shanty at the end of the lane, and arranged through Frank Delaney to drive out and see the field in person during the first week of March. While enough of the stand remained ungrazed to judge it fairly, he walked the field with Eli, much as Frank Delaney had in November, asking sharper questions, the questions of a man who intended to spend money on the answers, about acreage cost per head carried through the winter, about how the method would scale, about whether Eli would consider a contract to background cattle for other operations on turnip strips the following winter, on a fee basis, using ground beyond his own 10 acres if Owen Pratt's company covered the seed and lime. Eli listened to the whole proposal without interrupting, the way he listened to most things, and then said he appreciated the offer but did not intend to expand past what his own family and his own ground could manage carefully, because the 10 acres worked as well as they had, precisely because he had walked every foot of that fence line himself and knelt down in that dirt with his own hands before he ever bought a bag of seed, and he was not confident that the same attention would survive being spread across ground he did not know as well. Run for cattle that were not his to lose sleep over. Owen Pratt, who had heard a great many pitches for scaling up a good idea and rather fewer refusals delivered so plainly, did not press the point. He asked instead whether Eli would be willing to sell him, at a fair price, the surplus turnip seed Eli intended to save from his own best plants that spring for his own future planting. Enough for perhaps 20 acres of trial ground on a cooperating farm closer to the feed yard. And to that Eli agreed, and the 2 men shook hands on it, standing at the fence, a modest arrangement, a few $100s, and a small envelope of seed rather than a contract or a company, which was exactly the scale Eli had meant to keep it at, protecting what worked, rather than chasing what it might be worth if he let it grow past his own 2 hands. By late March, with the last of the turnip strip grazed down to bare stubble and the field due for spring plowing, and a rotation into oats, the ripple Owen Pratt's visit represented had already reached further than either of them likely expected, because Roy Callahan's 3 test acres behind his machine shed had been drilled the last week of that same month, using seed Eli had given him outright rather than sold, along with 2 full afternoons of Eli's time walking him through the strip fencing layout, an arrangement neither man described as a favor exactly, though it plainly was one. It was on one of those afternoons, with Roy Callahan's own drill running its calibration pass on the headland, that Eli's son Aaron, who had ridden along to watch, asked his father the question that had apparently been sitting with him since December, watching June push through the gate every morning ahead of the rest of the herd, which was why anyone would bother growing something nobody wanted to eat off a plate, when hay was so much less trouble to look at and to explain to a person driving by. Eli thought about it for a moment, the way he thought about most questions before answering them, and told his son that nothing was waste, only things that had not yet found their next job, and that the slope had not been dead ground those 6 years, so much as ground waiting on a question nobody had gotten around to asking it, and that writing a thing down, even a thing that looked useless at the time, was sometimes the only way of making sure the right question eventually got asked, by someone, even if it was not the same someone who wrote it. That evening, back at the house, Eli took his father's green ledger down from the shelf beside his own composition book, opened it to the entry dated the 9th of October. Tired don't mean finished. It only means it's due a different question. And beneath his father's small, careful, later years handwriting he wrote, in his own hand, a new line dated that day in March, asked and answered. 10 acres, 2 winters, 1 skeptic converted. And he closed the book and set it back on the shelf beside the newer one. The 2 records sitting together, the way his father's writing and his own now sat. Together in the field itself, one generation's patient attention, waiting for the next generation's willingness to read it slowly and act on it. Decades later, if that was what it took. The next morning, before the frost had fully lifted off the barnyard, Eli went out to check on June, who was heavy again that spring with a calf due in May, moving slowly and comfortably across the paddock in the pale early light, and he stood at the fence for a moment the way he always did, not celebrating anything, simply confirming with his own eyes what the record already told him, before he turned back toward the barn to start the morning's milking. Because the work, regardless of what the last 2 winters had proven, or who had come around to admitting it, was not finished, and never really would be, and that suited him fine. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told the ground they're standing on isn't worth the trouble. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you've ever put in a year of quiet work on something everyone around you had already written off as finished, I want to hear about it. Every comment gets read.